lo siento. Si les gustó esta canción, pueden escuchar esta y las otras en la playlist colaborativa que corresponde al primer desafío que lanzamos dentro del curso Descifrando el Derecho a la Ciudad, que estamos lanzando con la Plataforma Global por el Derecho a la Ciudad. Hoy estamos aquí para la tercera sesión. Antes de decir nada más, decirles que hay una traducción al inglés y al español, así que si lo necesitan en Zoom tienen el botón interpretación y ahí pueden elegir la lengua en la que prefieren oír las instrucciones, oír la presentación. Las presentaciones serán en inglés hoy. Bueno, como les decía, esta playlist colaborativa es del primer desafío.
Julieta,
¿sí?
Perdón, pero habla de la traducción también en inglés para que las personas que solamente comprenden inglés sepan que hay que cambiar.
You're right, Rodrigo, sorry. For the people speaking in English, we have an interpretation today, a translation in Spanish-English. So you have the button on the Zoom. You can click there, and you can choose the language you prefer. If you have any question, you can just ask us anything on the chat. And the presentations today will be in English, so yeah. I will continue in Spanish because it's easier for me. Bueno, les hablaba de los desafíos. Ahora, rápidamente, antes de empezar en la sesión 3, quería mostrarles algunas de las fotos del segundo desafío que lanzamos a los participantes. El desafío era mostrar imágenes mostrando qué es la ciudad. El derecho a la ciudad es para todas y para todos, para todes. He elegido algunas de manera aleatoria, ¿no? Se las paso rápidamente, compartiremos todos los materiales al final y la gente que no ha tenido todavía la ocasión de compartir sus fotos, tienen todavía todo el tiempo para hacerlo. Avanzo para poder seguir con la clase de hoy. Queríamos hacer solo un guiño a la clase anterior y así poder continuar con la de hoy. Como algunos ya lo saben, hoy es el Día de la Tierra y nos pareció que los temas que vamos a hablar hoy, de los que vamos a hablar hoy, resuenan mucho con este Día de la Tierra. Desde el Derecho a la Ciudad pensamos que la gente y el cuidado del planeta deben estar en el centro de todas las acciones políticas y políticas públicas que podemos hacer y llevar. Así que los temas de hoy van muy bien en acuerdo con todo esto. Les voy a presentar rápidamente a los ponentes de hoy. En primera parte tendremos a Sonia Díaz, que es de WIEGO. WIEGO es la Woman in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, perdón. Sonia Díaz es socióloga con un doctorado en ciencias políticas y una especialización en residuos. Es una investigadora activista y ha trabajado en puestos gubernamentales a nivel local y nacional. Con Sonia también tendremos el testimonio de Frances Onokpe, que es desde Nigeria, que es una comerciante de textiles y accesorios de moda. Tiene un diploma en catering y gestión hotelera y ella es actualmente tesorera nacional de FIWON, que es una federación de las organizaciones de trabajadores informales de Nigeria. Y finalmente tendremos a Judith Hitchman, que tiene una larga experiencia transnacional y una formación en gestión de comunicación interpersonal, pero que sobre todo ha desarrollado en los últimos años, ha trabajado como activista para la soberanía alimentaria. Ella nos hablará de la segunda parte de la clase. Y ella es actualmente presidente de Urgenci, que es una red global de agricultura apoyada por la comunidad. Así que eso, cualquier pregunta que tengan la pueden hacer por el chat. Tendremos las presentaciones y luego una parte de preguntas y respuestas. Dejo de compartir mi pantalla y le dejo la palabra a Sonia.
Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Hold on a minute. Okay, managed. Okay, I'm so glad to be here and also very glad that we have Francis from StreetNet International joining this session with me. And for us at WIEGO, the Right to the City, the global platform Right to the City, it's one of our key partners. And so it's very, I'm very happy because I'll be sharing a lot based on my experience as a garbologist, a sociologist, social scientist who is also an expert in solid waste. But we will be talking not only about my own experience, but we'll try to engage with how important the right to the city is for the informal economy. And so Francis' testimony will be key for us to understand how this concept is important for all of us. So here is the outline for our talk today. I want you to know a little bit about WIEGO, and then we will very quickly dive into the livelihoods perspective and how important this perspective is for its connection with the right to the city, and talk a little bit about the new urban agenda and the right to the city in relation to informal workers. And then we're going to have two cases. One is the case that I'm an expert on as a garbologist, so I will talk a little bit about waste pickers and the right to the city, some of the struggles and the challenges. And we will have Frances from StreetNet International giving her testimony, and we will close with some challenges and way forward. So about WIEGO. WIEGO is a global action research policy network that seeks to improve the status of the working poor, especially women. And we work with 4 sector groups: street vendors, waste pickers, domestic workers, and home-based workers. And basically, we work through programs that intend to increase organization representation of workers in the informal economy. We work towards improving statistics and research because we think that information and data can be very powerful. And we engage and advocate for more inclusive policy processes at the local, national to global levels. And we work towards more equitable trade, labor, urban planning, and social protection policies. We are based around the world in all the continents, and we work in 60 to 70 countries. And so what is the importance of the livelihoods perspective? The authors of a very important study on urban governance and poverty in 10 cities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they argue that livelihoods needs to be thought of in parallel with urban governance, infrastructure, and services. And thus, more information and data is necessary for us in relation to the multifaceted and differentiated nature of poverty and vulnerability and exclusion in cities of the world, and also more information in terms of what are the strategies for survival and coping of urban poor dwellers, because this is very important for us to design policies that can create room for inclusion of informal workers, of the working poor or the urban poor. So as they quote, the well-being of urban workers can be improved through access to greater economic opportunities, social support networks, and greater access to assets, land, property, infrastructure, and services. So what the authors argue is that the ability of the urban poor to articulate their demands and interests makes a difference. So organization is fundamental, and this is a kind of the backbone of the work that we do at WIEGO, because we have been working strongly over the more than 20 years since we exist as an organization in terms of supporting the organizing process of workers in the formal economy. And for us, and particularly, and you see when I move on to talk a bit about the case of waste speakers, the concept of right to the city is very important in the sense that it builds this kind of environment of an urban ethics, which is grounded on social justice and citizenship. And we don't need to go what it means. You guys have been discussing this, you know, in the previous sessions. But here I'm going to, amongst the many kind of rights that it's, you know, that the right to the city is composed of, I'm going to particularly to emphasize, you know, the right to work. Particularly the right to work, and particularly the right to have an inclusive city and an inclusive economy. Okay, so we have been engaged in all these discussions around the new urban agenda and the right to the city, and how important it is for us to challenge, you know, conventional notions of urban public spaces, so that we can have the acknowledgement of urban spaces as settings for social and cultural functions and livelihood activities. And in this sense, we want to make the case here that waste speakers and street vendors, they are contributors to public space culture and vibrancy, and they also contribute to the economic diversity. And excuse me, it seems there is a background noise. Perhaps someone has the mic open. Yeah. So I'm going to walk you through later on in this presentation on some examples in terms of the possibilities of inclusive urban planning, and the sense of you know, creating the room to integrate street vendors and waste speakers. Well, Francis will speak a bit more on that. I will speak more on waste speakers, and what is important for us here, you know, to say right away that for, you know, an inclusive city, we need, you know, inclusive and participatory processes, and we need to have platforms for participation, empowered participation, not only consultation. I want to stress that because very often people talk about an organization, especially, you know, big organizations like World Bank and other organizations, they speak about consultation as if this is participation. For me, this is just one level. So I want to stress here that an empowered participation is not only hearing the voices of, but also taking whatever is put on the agenda, taken into account when you do planning and implementation. And I want also to stress, you know, the importance of gender-sensitive urban planning and design of policies. This is very, very important. And the right to the city here, it's also a good framework for us when we think about gender inclusivity. So my point is economic diversity and gender equality are some of the key aspects of the right to the city approach that I want to emphasize here in our talk today. And in this way, what we are trying to challenge at WIEGO is this whole idea of modernization based on capital-intensive approaches. So for us, modernization of urban systems needs to build from what it already exists. In the case of waste pickers, which I'm an expert on, you know, we need to understand what is their contribution and improve solid waste management, drawing from this contribution. And the same, you know, goes for street vendors and other workers. So we need to challenge prevailing ideas that modern and progress is based on capital intensive and this very kind of beautiful aseptic cities that we model ourselves, you know, our cities in the global south. You know, I really don't want, you know, to have my city look like a city in Europe. I want my city, you know, to be vibrant. I want my city to have an approach that is people-centered. So this is very important in terms of an inclusive agenda. And we need thus to recognize, protect, and promote informal workers. Otherwise, we are not going to have an inclusive city. So let's go a little bit into details regarding waste pickers. And now, you know, I'm Brazilian, so I have to begin with what I know best. I've been engaged in, as an expert in solid waste management since the mid-1980s. So I followed up all the developments in terms of the struggles, the early struggles of waste pickers, in which at that point in Brazil, we were already the activists that supported waste pickers in that early moment in their process of organizing. We were already using and taking advantage of the concept of right to the city as a way to struggle for integration of these workers in solid waste systems as service providers. So recyclers, not only in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America, people, activists started to claim the right to labor in the streets of the urban centers, as the workers, waste pickers or recyclers, whatever name term we use, they were there roaming for recycling materials. And they started demanding urban infrastructure for their sorting practices and the rights to be contracted out by municipalities. So, and particularly in the case of Brazil, these claims were framed under the right the cities. And I want to talk a little bit of an experience which was fundamental in my area, solid waste management. I began my career working in slum upgrading program, if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the first in Brazil. It was called Prodecon. And at that point in time, we were challenging prevailing notions around slums and informal settlements. And through the work that we started in my city, Belo Horizonte, in the southeast of Brazil, we started changing the paradigms in slum upgrading and in waste management. So in this program, that was a program run by our provincial government, the state of Minas Gerais, and with funds from GIZ and an Italian ABSI, which is an Italian cooperation agency, we were implementing urban infrastructure in the shanty towns of my city. And we were challenging the notion of eviction and providing land regularization so that the informal settlements had access to ownership of the land and houses. And through participatory planning, we started identifying a number of needs of that community that I worked on. And one of the main demands was the right to have regular service of waste collection in a shanty town. That was very clear. And we started designing a project that enabled regular waste collection, household waste collection in that shanty town. And from that moment on, we saw that waste was an incredible area to work on around rights to organize, rights to the city, broader kind of struggles. And the work that we started back then in that shanty town, it evolved in terms of having us supporting the creation of the first cooperatives in Brazil here in my city. And later on with the experience that we had being in government, we started the first partnership of waste pickers and a municipal cleaning agency, in which that cooperative was hired, contracted to be the service provider of recycling collection for the whole town. So as you can see, we moved from the right to have access for informal dwellers, people who lived in informal settlements, in shanty towns, slums, to have collection of waste in their homes. From that on, we moved to working with informal recyclers, many of them living in shanty towns, right? And all this work, I won't get into much details, but all this work led later on in 2001 for the creation of a national movement of cooperatives of waste pickers in my country, Brazil. And now I give you a little bit of some flash information on some local victories that we have around acknowledgement of the rights to work of informal recyclers. Here is, an example of my town. As I said, we implemented in 1993 a partnership with the cooperative. At that point in time, there was only one cooperative, but We now have 8 cooperatives. They are all contracted by the city to do collection of recyclables. And we also, I was actually part of this process because I was a city officer back then. You know, one of my previous lives, I was a city officer. And another project that we implemented that acknowledged the right to the city was a project with collectors of debris, of construction waste, which is different from collectors of recyclables such as plastic and glass and etc. So this is an example of a project we implemented in my city in which we acknowledged the constructors of debris to work in the city, and we built reception units for them to collect debris from whatever place they collected them from and take it to a place which we as a city collected the debris in bulk, and we took it to a recycling unit for construction waste. So just one example of how we can acknowledge the rights to work for informal workers. Here an example of acknowledgement of public spaces as as a way for workers to express their culture. This is the carnival that when we were in the city, we organized this event for 10 years, the Carnival of Waste Pickers. Here, another picture, it's more recent. We have been doing work with informal collectors that are not part of cooperatives and using public space for expression of their, culture. And some national victories. We formed multi-stakeholder platforms to organize the demands of waste pickers. And in Brazil, we recognized that waste pickers are preferential service providers for waste, for collection of recyclables. And here is another example of acknowledgement of rights to work in public space in Salvador, Brazil, but also in my city, Belo Horizonte. There have been projects around in which the city organized with collectors of recyclables, special systems for the carnival events, so that waste pickers and also informal and also street vendors can have infrastructure to support their work during this festivity. And here, just very briefly, before I move on to another topic, we have a number of struggles around human rights and right to the cities in Latin America. And we in Colombia, just to focus on one country only, Colombian waste pickers have been granted the rights to be integrated as service providers. They have victories that dates back from 2009. And very briefly, before I pass on to Frances to speak about street vendors, during COVID-19, we can see how devastating the impacts are on informal workers and how this the pandemic has posed threats to the right to the city, to human rights, and particularly in my country, Brazil, under Bolsonaro government, the shrinking of democracy, it's something that's unimaginable. And at WIEGO, we have been documenting what is going on in the world, and particularly here in my country, I've been carrying on research documenting impacts of COVID-19 in 150 cooperatives across 22 states of Brazil. We have this data available. And at WIEGO, when COVID-19 hit us all, we quickly started working with each sector group, the domestic workers, home-based workers, street vendors, and waste pickers to identify their needs and work with them towards addressing the main issues regarding the pandemics. And we help them in emergency relief committees. We supported and advocated for cash grants. We've been tracking policies, doing research, and also drafting guidelines for workers' health. This is the guideline we drafted for the waste speakers, but we had for other sector groups, for street vendors, and etc. So I'll stop there. And I give the floor to Frances, and I'll stop sharing so she can, share her slides, and then I'll be back for wrapping up.
Thank you, Sonia. Hello. Hello.
Hi, Francis. We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sonia. I'm happy to be with you. I'll be talking about two different major things concerning street vendors in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, we have a lot of, we have 80% of non-agricultural employed, 60% of urban employment, and over 90% of new jobs in Nigeria. While we face a lot of extortion, arbitrary arrest, and imprisonment from government. And FIWON has tried all the possible best to work along. And I'll tell you a brief history of FIWON. FIWON is an overall goal is to transform working and living standard of informal workers. We've been building leadership capacity for informal workers to receive their rights violation. We taught them their rights, representation in decision-making and public institution. We have a cooperative and trip section that provides soft loan for our members. And at the same time, we collaborate with public and private institutions. The right to street vendor in public space is a big challenge in Nigeria, because we face a lot of eviction and demolition on traders operating in the traditional open markets, which has been a big challenge for us. And this has caused a lot of problem for our members, inability to pay for short space. They will come and demolish the traditional markets, promising to build a very good edifice mall for us. At the end of the day, building the mall, the members cannot be able to afford to pay for the rent, which is a big problem. And it has caused a kind of backward coping strategy that leads to some of our members withdrawing their children from school. And you see them selling on the streets, which is a kind of challenge that we have. Most of them have withdrawn their children from school because of this kind of problem. And at the same time, when the market is being built, the ultra-modern markets, we didn't have access to them. So which is a big challenge for street vendors. We've been marginalized. So we now form a quorum, and we felt if policymakers and development experts can cooperate with FIWON, we can do the campaign vigorously together for inclusive urban development policies, which we believe can be done in due course. And these ultra-modern markets should include economically disadvantaged traders that can be able, so that we can be able to assess the facilities. The facilities were well built, but the rent is just too high. If you look at the slide, my first slide, which is on the demolition, you see that we have old traditional stores that were demolished. And if you go to the way forward, you see the slide where we have the modern shops, the modern mall that was built, which most of our members cannot afford to even pay the rent. So along the line, I feel informal workers suffer a lot because during the lockdown, we faced a lot of challenges. That was during the COVID, the pandemic. Most people suffer hunger. And we had a lot of rape cases of women and elderly women that were reported. We have a case that the lady was trying to fend for the children and she was raped along the line, which was a big blow to our members, and we had to rally around her to solve this problem. And street vendors who tried to operate skeletally in the neighborhood then were embarrassed. They were arrested, they were molested, and we had to go back to our cooperative so that they can have access to the little money they have in the cooperative to fend for themselves, which helped them along the line a lot. So this is why we never even knew this is going to happen before we started the cooperative for our members so that they can have something to fall back to, which has really helped us. And street vendors have a lot of challenges that we feel we should stand up and fight for the cause, and which we have done, and which we are still soliciting for, that the government should include FIWON into all their strategic plans. Hello? Hi.
Yes, we can hear you, Francis.
Okay, all right. And on food insecurity, we have a lot of problems. General price of food in Nigeria has increased by 80%. And why did this happen? We have a lot of insurgency. Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, nomadic Fulani, herdsmen and farmers on land grazing in the southwest and the central Nigeria, which has given us a lot of setback. And the COVID-19 experience was so bitter. There has been the value of currency. We had higher increments in fuel prices, which has even made our people not to be able to even move from one location to another. And a lot of climate change has affected our street vendors that are selling perishable foods, and the erosion has really worked on them because of the climate change. And the food chain supply has reduced. Movement of food from one location to another has been a big problem for us. And we don't have adequate assistance from the government. And at the same time, during the lockdown, a lot of vehicles were impounded with their goods. So which we tried as much as possible to raise eyebrow on, and we were able to retrieve some of our members' things. But the most important thing is we have been making advocacy visits and trying to let the government understand that should include us. They should include FIWON as a voice of the voiceless, who are of the street vendors, so that in anything they want to do, in any decision making, FIWON should be partner, and we should find solution to all this, because we have not been included in the urban city agenda, which has been a big problem. So I'm rounding up here. I would say a big thank you to the organizers and Sonia and the other women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franz.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Sonia, you can go ahead.
Okay, hold on a minute. I'm just sharing. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, Sonia.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much, Francis, for sharing with us. And so I think what Francis has said, and also the case that I made in terms of the way speakers. We need to, it all makes the case for us around how important it is for us to build strategic alliance between informal waste pickers and informal workers organizations at large, organizations of street vendors, and allies that can help improving and moving forward the agenda of urban solid, inclusive urban waste systems, urban systems at large, that systems that are committed to inclusivity. And for that, we need to build capacity for informal workers. We need to address the issue of legal framework. I saw that people are discussing formalization. What kind of formalization? We need to formalize in ways that are proper, because most often people think about formalization in the sense of making that organization legal so that it can pay taxes. So we need to understand that formalizing from a worker's perspective needs the enabling environment, which means, the legal framework, it means building capacity, it means recognizing the role and contribution of informal workers at large, and it needs the redesign of value chains by principles related to fairness. This means that we need a kind of new social contract in which the right to work, the right to work, it's one of the pillars, it's fundamental. And so I think particularly through, this is nothing new, but I guess COVID-19 added, additional layers of vulnerability, additional layers of threats, and informal waste workers, in street vendors, domestic workers, other informal workers, they have suffered much more than they have in terms of stigmatization since the pandemics, and they suffered, incredible losses. WIEGO has some research, which I will not dwell on it here, but in our website, you guys are happy to look for some documentation on how informal workers are being hit by COVID-19. But what is important here is that the injustices that these workers suffer, that we understand that there are a lot of dimensions that brings different layers of vulnerability. Being a woman, depending on where you are, issues regarding caste, race, and we do need to build inclusive cities that are inclusive for all, because otherwise we won't be talking about inclusive city at all. And I think the right to the city can be a tool for social justice struggles. If you are willing to read a bit more and dig a bit more and do a bit of further reading here, some of suggestions, and we have much more in our website in English, Spanish, and French, and a little in Portuguese. And yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to share our stories with you.
Muito obrigado, Sonia.
Muchísimas gracias, Sonia, por esta presentación, y a Francis por este testimonio tan valioso, ¿no? También ayuda a ver que las luchas son las mismas en diferentes partes del mundo. Después de esta primera parte, y además muchas gracias porque estuvieron justo en los tiempos, así que para mí perfecto.
And we are
Well,
Latin. I am Latin, you know.
así que ahora vamos a pasar a Judith. If you want to share your screen, Judith, and so you can start your presentation.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Judith Hitchman, as I was presented. I'm president of Urgenci, which is the Global Community Supported Agriculture Network that represents about 3 million people at global level, and now also one of the joint coordinators of the RIPESS Intercontinental, which is the intercontinental network for the promotion of social and solidarity economy. After your presentation, Sonia, I really feel like I should change everything I've got in mind, because I've made a much more theoretical presentation, and you were really illustrating the current situation. I'd just like to begin by two very small reactions to your presentations. Firstly, that the right to the city needs to also include the right to food, I believe, because it is one of the fundamental human rights. And secondly, to say that I totally agree that we need to work on bringing people from the informal sector into the formal sector to give them social protection, to provide social safety nets, healthcare, and where possible, basic income, minimum income. And I'd like to say that RIPESS is working on this in West Africa, in particular in Mali. And I think that we should all have a small conversation about that after this webinar. I'm going to speak now about the questions of food sovereignty and solidarity economy linked to the right to the city. As I said, I'm president of the Global Community Supported Agriculture Network, and we have two pillars. One is food sovereignty, and the other is social and solidarity economy, which takes us very naturally into the Intercontinental Network for a Social and Solidarity Economy. And RIPESS is a member of the Global Platform for the Right to the City. So that gives you the different tiers of our affiliation and how we come to be here. So some of the things that we need to look at and to consider are, first of all, the size of the town and the city, and the policy for land conservation for growing food. Historically, towns or cities had a food shed, a food net, and it was the land around the city that was used to feed that city and the inhabitants. But the question today is, who is producing the food and where is it being produced for all the human settlements? Another question we need to look at is public procurement for schools, for hospitals, and for other public institutions. How can we make it more local? How can we make it more agroecological to ensure that it is healthy food that is feeding our cities? And I must say that in Brazil, the origins of feeding school children local, organic, or agroecological food were exemplary. Another question is, are canteens just for eating, or are they not also places perhaps for educating people? Another issue is nutritional value versus calories and non-communicable diseases. In the poorer populations, the more socially excluded populations, the food that they can buy in many, many cities is the cheapest food in supermarkets. And this is the food that is the most highly processed, that contains a lot of fats and sugars, and that is contributing to a global health crisis. Because although there are undernourished people in the world today, there are as many overnourished people. And this is really the question of calories versus healthy food. So in terms of our cities, how do we create sustainable local chains for supplying food to those cities? How do we create sustainable employment within those chains? And what economic model do we want to have to ensure that people are eating healthily and locally, and that people have jobs that provide them with a decent livelihood? Because there's some inherent contradictions between the present system and what we would like to see. So there are lots of terms: people's economy, social economy, solidarity economy, cooperatives, social enterprises, collectives. All of these are different terms, including inclusive economy that Sonia mentioned, to talk about a different kind of economy from the neoliberal system of capitalism. In the title, we also talk about food sovereignty. Now, what is food sovereignty? It is the right of peoples to healthy, culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to access and decide on their own food and agricultural systems. Now, this definition comes from the first food sovereignty gathering that was held in Selenge in 2007. It was called Nyeleni, which was the name of a peasant woman who had contributed a great deal to the food movement in her time. And if we look at the food sovereignty movement, and if we look at the social solidarity economy movement, both are 25 years old this year. And this is something we must celebrate jointly and collectively. While some parts of the social solidarity economy movement go back much further, like the historical creation of the cooperative movement, which goes back a couple of hundred years now. But both food sovereignty and the social solidarity economy, as in RIPESS, go back 25 years this year. So this is something that we need to put back on the agenda and place it center stage in the current crisis. Because the crisis is economic, it is social, it is a health crisis.
Judith,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It seems that something is blocking the mic, the microphone. We cannot hear you well.
Oh.
Now we can listen to you. I think
Okay.
something was blocking the mic.
I don't know what. What did you miss?
Just the last two sentences.
Okay. So to summarize, social and solidarity economy and food sovereignty are both celebrating 25 years of existence this year. So this is a definition of solidarity economy, and it really brings together all the different forms of alternatives to the present system, with an emphasis on democratic governance, gender equality, which Sonia mentioned, trade justice, food sovereignty, environmental respect, social inclusion, and so on. And together it forms an alternative, viable economy to the present system. So basically, we're facing very key choices because the United Nations have signed an agreement with the World Economic Forum, with people like Bill Gates behind it, And they want what they call the big reset, which is the corporate takeover of the world, not just our food systems. It's much more than that. It's our health systems, it's our financial systems, it's everything. But in this case, I'm talking about food systems, and this is an illustration of what we could have but don't want. Do we want more people to be healthy, or do we want them to suffer from increased non-communicable diseases? And I would just like to say that in the case of COVID, healthy, fresh fruit and vegetables are essential to be able to fight COVID and to be healthy in terms of the pandemic. So what is the situation today? We have 20 global corporations that control the food system. 3 biggest ones control seeds. 4 corporations control 99% of livestock breeding. 10 corporations control 55% of fertilizers. 4 traders control 75% of the grain and soybean market, and 11 corporations control 30% of the food processing industry. Now, in Brazil, there really is a very strong alternative food production system through the movement of small-scale food producers, the MPA, who have been absolutely championing the right to food by bringing supplies into the disadvantaged areas of cities and feeding people on the logic that food is part of the commons and is a human right. And in times of the pandemic, everybody should have the right to eat. So that is one way of fighting the corporate system. In Brazil, we have community-supported agriculture in something like 150 different groups all over Brazil. So it is going direct from producer to consumer, healthy agroecological food as a way.
Judith, so sorry. Again, the mic.
Hello?
Now we can hear you well. The last 3 sentences we missed.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. I don't know. This is an old computer.
No worries.
I was saying that in Brazil, community-supported agriculture is growing phenomenally as well. There are over 150 groups in our network covering all of Brazil. And again, this is developing very strongly in times of COVID. So some figures, as I said, 1 in 10 people is malnourished. 30% of the population is overweight. 1 in 5 people in developed countries like France cannot afford 3 meals a day or fresh fruit and vegetables. You know, you might think of a country like France as being developed, but there is a huge amount of social exclusion. And 20% of the population in developed countries need food support. Now that 20% is closer to 40% today with COVID throughout the developed countries, from the United States to the United Kingdom and France and in many other places. And I read a couple of days ago that 60% of the population in Brazil is now food insecure, which is absolutely terrifying. We need change, we need system change, and we need it now. But 70% of our food, although there is the huge industrial long over-processed food chain, 70% of our food is produced by small-scale food producers, and it can be sourced locally. Now, how does this work out in terms of cities? There are many different ways. There are local farmers markets, there are public allotments, there are community gardens. Some people still have gardens to grow their own. Other people can grow small amounts of food on their balconies. There are community-supported agriculture schemes, local food co-ops, local collective producers shops, solidarity shops and systems of many different kinds, and also farms selling their produce directly online. So really what it boils down to is an increasingly difficult struggle between neoliberalism versus grassroots ownership of our systems and outcomes. And that is true for the food system, but it is true for the energy production. It's true for our financial institutions. It's true for all aspects of the economy. The stakeholder model is more participatory, but it does rather tend towards just green capitalism and corporate social responsibility. So we need to be very careful at grassroots level and social movement level that our good ideas are not just being captured by the corporations, and it's happening all the time. So solidarity economy and food sovereignty represent systemic change, and they are part of agroecology as recognized by the Food and Agriculture Institute Organization of the United Nations. Food sovereignty and agroecology include and must include an economic paradigm change in terms of the way our societies and our cities function. So community-supported agriculture, as I said, is built on the pillars of food sovereignty and economy, and is an integral part of agroecology, which is as much agricultural techniques as social inclusion. At the Agroecology Forum, again held in Mali, in Yeleni, in March 2015, part of the final declaration said that we should build local economies, promote local markets for local products, support the development of alternative financial infrastructure, institutions, and mechanisms for both producers and consumers, reshape our food markets through new relationships and solidarity between producers and consumers, and develop links with the experience of solidarity economy and participatory guarantee systems where appropriate. Now, listening to the testimony from Nigeria, I was really struck by the way in which food has been commodified throughout the COVID crisis. Prices have increased exponentially in the industrial food chains. Food is not a commodity. Food and agriculture need to be removed from the World Trade Organization and come back into the hands of local communities, cities, and citizens. So what does all of this look like? Well, it's a very biodiverse bouquet with many different flavors, because everybody can organize these things as culturally appropriate and as suits wherever they happen to be living. If we look at the different sizes of human settlements, there are certain positives and certain challenges. For example, in a small town or a village, the municipality may still own land or know producers in person and be able to really support the introduction of local public canteens, access to land for new farmers, transmitting land from one generation to the next. One of the challenges is that very often for canteens, there are no longer collective kitchen facilities because the catering has been handed over to industrial companies, so that these facilities need to be rebuilt. In medium-sized towns or small cities, it's still quite easy to develop municipal policy and ensure the land use is protected from urban sprawl, because we really have to use things like community land trusts to protect the land around cities in order to have agricultural production to feed the cities. And again, the challenges are the long-standing contracts with industrial food companies and also property speculation. In large towns or cities, you need to break this down and start working at neighborhood level. And for example, the best example I know of that is in Barcelona, where the municipality used participatory processes in order to see what people wanted, what people had, what people needed in the different neighborhoods. And the challenge there, of course, is the preservation of land and also oceans from speculation. So there are some examples of good practice. I know many, but in all of those cases, I don't have the time to give you all the key examples here today. So again, if we look at a small town or village, many people are still producing some or all of their own food. The challenges are land zoning and maintaining the traditional producer to consumers through public markets. In medium-sized towns and small cities, you can develop some good municipal policy for some self-production and access. A lot of families still have access to people from their family who live in the country and who will send them eggs or chickens or fruit and veg into the town. The big issue here is the introduction of supermarkets. And that is a particularly hot issue, for example, in West Africa and in some Asian countries, because industrial food is taking over from the traditionally produced food. In large towns or cities, again, as I said, you can work at participatory neighborhood level and you need to keep and protect the land. So traditional diets are part of our cultural heritage. So they're really linked very closely to food sovereignty. And food systems have become linked to the governance of the global food and agriculture with the commodification of seeds and inputs like pesticides and fertilizers, as well as the commercialization of the processed food. Now that is the antipodes, the opposite of food sovereignty. And these are the changes that
Sorry, Judith, we can't hear you now.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you, yes.
Okay. So if you look at this diagram, it shows some, in fact, most of the areas where a social and solidarity economy can create new forms of commons through community land management, community finance management, community water management, community transport management, education, seeds through community seed banks, community radio, community culture, cultural centers, and community health management. So this is really how we can take social and solidarity economy as a whole and apply it to a community-based system within the right to the city and everywhere. So what are the benefits of a local food system? From producer to consumer, such as community-supported agriculture. First, you have safe, fresh food from a known source, which means you can trust the person who grows your food. In terms of climate, you have very low food miles, no or very little packaging. You have ecological farming, and all of this mitigates climate change, which is essential. You can build an agroecological community system where the municipality will also support those people who need the support to access healthy food through a variety of different schemes, through stamps, through different forms of accessing fresh, healthy food. You can build a local economy and decommodify the food. It means you need to re-educate the community on food. And this is really important and quite difficult because it also implies being able to cook your own food. And in many very dense cities around the world today, people no longer have kitchens. So that is a real issue. But above all, it is a way of breaking with industrial agriculture and agri-food and moving away from land grabbing, as well as creating healthy diets and nutritional benefits for people. All of this needs framework legislation to link food sovereignty, solidarity economy, and agroecology. It means connecting farmers to markets and urban-rural linkages. Now, there is some very good policy at UN level in the Committee on Food Security on connecting farmers to markets. There is framework legislation on social and solidarity economy in over 30 countries and quite a number of municipalities around the world. So I think that the framework legislation for the right to the city needs to and should include food sovereignty and solidarity economy and agroecology as key levers. This is a handbook on the policy document connecting smallholders to markets. It was produced by the civil society mechanism of the
Sorry, Judith, again, your mic.
That was produced by the civil society mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security. And it is a very good handbook. So we're living in a period where human rights are seriously under threat, where there's an increased level of repression, where many people have been betrayed in countries by the elected duty bearers, where international trade agreements threaten our human rights and our sovereign rights and our access to and right to food. We have the threat of corporate capture and distribution chains. We have green and blue washing. We have the compartmentalization of institutions and their incapacity to work with complex adaptive situations. We have the fact that the corporations and the institutions want to move very fast, but social movements, because they are consensual and consultative, take time to reach decisions. So we need to impose the time we need on municipalities in order to get things better and get them right. If we look at the SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, and many other UN sources, how do grassroots networks like WIEGO, like RIPESS, like the Right to the City access and control funding? That is a really big question. And all of the issues of agricultural workers, migrant workers, people in informal employment under COVID who lose their jobs, then lose their home, then cannot afford to buy food is a critical issue. The International Labour Organization estimates that there will be about 200 million additional people suffering from hunger and social exclusion in the coming months. So it really is a very, very dire situation at present, as Sonia already said. So that is what we're against. Our strength is that we can organize among ourselves as communities. We need to really push for additional frameworks for legislation based on the existing body of what is out there. If we look at some of the things we need to improve, conventional industrial agriculture and processed food might be cheap, but the workers are not getting paid. There is virtually slave labor here in Europe, in Spain and in Italy, where migrant workers from Africa and other parts of the world are overly exploited, where pesticides and other harmful chemical inputs are destroying people's health and children's health in particular. And these foods that are available with the externalization of the financial costs have very poor nutritional value. And a lot of that, the nutritional value of fresh food is lost in the processing. Compared with that, you see an increasing amount of industrial organic food in supermarkets. Obviously, it is better than food that contains high levels of chemicals, but it is still based on weak soil, because in that case, the microbiome of the soil when it is industrial is weaker, and it leads to a lesser nutritional value and a poorer human microbiome. So people are not as able to fight disease. Again, it is better, but when you have beans from Kenya being sold in France or in Ireland in the summer when local production of beans is at its peak, it really does not solve the problem. And the land on which those beans are grown in Kenya is the land that people traditionally grew their own food on. So people are working for very low salaries and are no longer food self-sufficient. When you have agroecologically, locally grown food, it is richer in nutrition, the soil microbiome is healthier, human beings, and especially children, are healthier. And also, fresh farm to fork provides optimum nutrition. And I would like to say, when it is a local direct food chain, producers can gain decent livelihoods, afford to pay their workers, and consumers do not need to pay that much more if the middleman is cut out. So the importance of municipalities in engaging. The framework legislation exists in many cases. Almost everywhere around the world, there is delegation to municipal level of land zoning, and also for questions of food of social inclusion. So these are things that can be worked on at local level in cities in order to improve livelihoods and the right to food and food sovereignty. Citizens' participation, participatory governance, can come into play through food policy councils and through community land trusts. Local solidarity public procurement means rebuilding an integrated and sustainable food system, and communities are strongest at local level, but need to be networked beyond the local, which is where networks like the RIPESS and Urgenci and the global platform all come into their own. So the economic model for green public procurement means ensuring that green belts, the green zone around cities for agricultural production, is protected. And there is a tool called the Voluntary Guidelines for the protection of land tenure and forests, which is produced again by the participation of civil society in the Committee on World Food Security and has been adopted by the FAO. Community land trusts, producers collectives and cooperatives, parent-teacher associations and local solidarity partnerships between municipalities, producers and consumers, and participatory municipal policies and budgeting are all part of social solidarity economy, part of the commons, part of sustainable territorial food systems and local economic development. So the questions we need to really be asking are, where and how is food produced? Can consumers buy their food outside the industrial food system? What are the impacts of an increasingly urbanized society on people's diets? What are the options? What systems of governance do we want and need for the alternatives? And how does this connect to the nutritional dimension? And how can we move forward from cheap industrial food production and the poverty for farmers, farm workers, to decent livelihoods and the healthy, affordable, nutritious food? And there, again, there is a tool which was negotiated. It is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Living in Rural Areas. That is a very precious one in terms of the last question there. We need to build consumer awareness on cooking from scratch, less fat, less sugar, less meat. Fruit and vegetables must be affordable to consumers, but not at the expense of the producers or farm workers. And that means we need to change the system. Nutrition is clearly linked to agroecology through soil health and plant vitality and agrobiodiversity. And again, these are how to do it through local producers markets, community-supported agriculture, food banks that are working with municipalities and local producers, community gardens, collective purchasing schemes, collective farmer and co-op shops, and box schemes. So what we want to get out of all of this is social and food justice. Agroecology includes that. Connecting territorial farmers to territorial markets, advocacy for the policy framework legislation, system change and not climate change, rebuilding urban and rural linkages, and access to and preservation of land, water, and seeds. And doing all of this through solidarity partnerships and solidarity economy. So these are some links. There are many others that I can send you, and I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you because also the timing was perfect. So now we can go to some questions. We have a lot of comments in the chat, a lot of exchanges of experiences, and most in Latin America, but some in Europe too. And so the first question will be for Sonia. I will speak in Spanish now, sorry, because the question is in Spanish, so it will be much easier. Una pregunta para Sonia, sobre los trabajadores informales. Resumo porque hay muchas cosas. La pregunta sería, ¿cómo hacer para formalizar a estos trabajadores? Si las oportunidades que se les pueden abrir tienen que ser siempre dentro de los residuos o bueno, en lo que estén trabajando, ¿no? De manera informal, o si se puede imaginar abrir a otros sectores, proponiendo educación, proponiendo formaciones en otros dominios. Y una pregunta muy puntual sobre los ingresos de estos trabajadores informales en relación más o menos a un salario mínimo, si hay estudios sobre esto, si saben algunas cosas. Esta sería una primera pregunta.
Thank you. Gracias, muchas gracias. Well, let's on formalization. I think it's very important that we reflect that formalization might mean different things to different people. And I think if we look at the perspective of organizations of informal workers, we would need to monitor and assess what formalization means for each specific sector in a given country, okay? So WIEGO has been working for quite some time in developing guidelines to assess, you know, the different approaches to formalization. And usually we like to ask ourselves, you know, some overarching questions. So my suggestion is, if you are in a given country and if you're working with a given sector, you would need to address this question. So one of the questions could be, you know, what problem is the formalization initiative designed to address? You know, who is being formalized? Is it the informal activity? Is it the business, or is it the place of work? You know, what are the terms and conditions of the work of the informal work? And I won't go on with all the questions that WIEGO has been formulating to dig deeper into this issue. But I think for me, the essential question is, what are the terms and conditions of the work of the informal worker? Because most often, as I had anticipated in my talk, formalization is thought as something to make you know, the activity or the organization legal, and it not necessarily means that it will bring about the improvement of workers' condition. You know, how are we addressing issues regarding social protection? How are we addressing issues regarding occupation and health? Are we addressing gender equality? So we work under, you know, a framework that is kind of much broader. In my country, you know, I'm in the sector that I work with, waste speakers. The organizing through cooperatives is a way to formalize, because it's a way to get workers under, you know, a workers' organization, but at the same time, it hasn't necessarily meant that all workers under, you know, a cooperative are being able to access, for instance, social pensions. Why? Because overall, in Brazil, we still need to do a lot of work to change the legal framework for popular cooperatives, because we have our cooperative law that benefits much more these kind of big cooperatives, such medical cooperatives and some other and in other sectors. So for the popular cooperatives, we don't have a legislative body that allows them to offer for their members, full protection. So all in all, what I want to say is let's look at each sector in each country and put ourselves some of these questions to identify what's the best way for formalization of workers. And in terms of ingressos, income, here in Brazil, it all depends. If you are a worker in a cooperative, depending on the kind of arrangements the cooperative has in a given city, they will have this or that income. Overall, most of the workers in Brazil, in a recent study that was done by the National Movement of Waste Speakers, the majority, I think over 50%, I'm quoting by heart, I don't have the data right in front of me, so, but if I'm not mistaken, over 60% were earning more than the Brazilian income salary.
Okay, thank you very much. There were also some questions or remarks about with this formalization. Do we want to create or imagine new forms of economy, or do we want to bring the informal workers into the system that doesn't work? So I thought this was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I guess, in a way I addressed it when I was making that remarks. We need to understand what will be the best way to formalize for a given sector in a given country. In Brazil, as I said, we took the road of getting workers formalized through cooperatives, okay? But I'm very well aware that, for instance, if I take South Africa, most workers that don't, cooperative is not the way that they think it's the way for them to formalize. So it's kind of context-based, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I have some questions for Judith. Let me also in Spanish read it directly. Una pregunta de Valentina Ortega. Pregunta cómo podemos materializar la soberanía alimentaria al nivel de las ciudades que tenemos hoy, considerando la lógica capitalista de monocultivo, acumulación, extractivismo, mercantilización de la vida. Valentina es de Chile y dice: el campo escasea en muchos lugares y en países como Chile, y el transporte de alimentos de un punto a otro es carísimo, y los camioneros han estado en contra del pueblo históricamente. Bueno. Y luego tenemos otra pregunta de Ramón para Judith, ahora en inglés, la leo directamente. Judith, thank you. I want to ask you about your opinion on the role of the United Nations Organization in relation to the control of food by international corporations.
Okay, I'm not sure if I understood the first question correctly, but if I did understand, it was the issue of how to rebuild the urban-rural linkages. And I think that it's a complex question. It's not easy. Generally, with community-supported agriculture, it is the producer who works with a group of consumers in the city, and the food is shared once a week, and it's brought into the city, not by industrial truck drivers, but by the producer or someone he or she knows who can do this. And because you're creating an alternative to the traditional system, it is one based on trust, it's one based on solidarity economy. Very often the distribution of the food shares is at a school or at a cultural center or somewhere where there are existing alternative groups that are happy to host the distribution. Again, the same with farmers markets. In many places, there are new alternative agroecological farmers markets, like in China, where the Chinese Community Supported Agriculture Network has built up a network of farmers, genuine, real farmers markets in some of the cities. I showed you a photo of one of the Chinese girls having a look at which tomatoes she wanted in the presentation. It's not easy because you have to rebuild links that have been broken between urban and rural populations. In terms of the UN system, I've been working with our different networks, doing advocacy in different UN institutions for the last 12 or 15 years. And initially, I think that civil society organizations, collectively, the social movements, particularly in the food and agriculture sector, had some very important wins, particularly the reform of the Committee on World Food Security with the creation of the civil society mechanism, where social movements and NGOs collectively work together, have the same rights as states in terms of policy negotiations, just do not vote. And that was a huge gain, and it goes back to about 2012, 2010, the reform of the Committee on World Food Security. Now, with the hardening of the neoliberal system, many of those rights are being challenged. All human rights are being challenged today, and that includes within the UN system. For example, the UN Food Systems Summit was decided by the UN Secretary General. It's totally top down. So social movements are not going to step into that space, and organizations that are not legitimate are being co-opted into it. What is positive at UN level is that there is a UN interagency task force on social and solidarity economy that RIPESS has been an observer of since its creation, and where we supply all the case studies and input a great deal for papers, and where we are now very rapidly moving to a UN official recognition of social and solidarity economy. And the UN General Secretary has officially said in, when was it, last September, that he believes that social and solidarity economy is going to be an essential element in the building blocks in the post-COVID period. So we need to take these things and use them as best we can and fight against the corporate control of Bill Gates and company, of the UN institutions, because the new approach is multi-stakeholderism replacing multilateralism. And you see this translated on the ground by a huge number of assassinations and repression and incarceration of people's movements, activists, be it in the food sovereignty movement or other. So I hope that that answers the two questions.
Yes, I think so. You have one more question that I want to join with a comment. A question from Guatemala, from Marixa Contreras. She's wondering, how can we recognize the people working in food sovereignty and agriculture, and how can they get good semillas? I get the word.
Okay, the seed sovereignty.
Seeds.
If she wants to write to me, I will give her the name and address of somebody in Guatemala who works on peasant seeds.
Okay. Okay, that's a very good answer. And then we have a lot of comments about how can we put the social and familiar economy and above sorry, I don't find the words. The difference between seguridad alimentaria, I will speak in Spanish, I'm sorry.
Food security and food sovereignty.
Yeah, and food sovereignty.
Okay, food security means you have enough calories to feed you. Food sovereignty means you have some empowerment and control over the food system, and you have access to and the right to cultivate and the right to eat what is culturally appropriate. But food security is just very simply ensuring that you have enough calories per day to survive. It does not deal with the essential quality of the food, how it is produced, how it is distributed, or anything.
So food sovereignty would be much more empowerment, right, Judith?
Food sovereignty is all empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the really basic thing is food security. If you have a hurricane disaster, for example, the first thing is to make sure that people have access to water and to food. That is food security. And it can be necessary. You know, I'm not saying that food security has no role. The World Food Programme will fly in and distribute food that will keep people alive. But it has no link to, for example, the really important question from Guatemala about peasant seeds and access to the right to culturally appropriate food.
If I may make a comment.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much for talking about food security and food sovereignty. Just to talk just very briefly about an experience that we have here in my city. It's called the Zero Waste program. Yeah. And it's in a neighborhood that we selected a territory where we had a waste picker cooperative working in that area. And the program is all about trying to implement processes of collecting recyclables that people from that neighborhood can bring to a special place that we have, in which the waste picker co-op members work and collect, receive the recyclables that the population source segregate. But we also have this land in this area where we have now even my English it's failing me. Una horta comunitaria. We have a
community garden.
Yeah, we have a garden, vegetable garden, and we have composting, and we are a bunch of people from that neighborhood that we pay, a monthly fee and for assessing the services. So I bring, my own food wastes every week, and I also bring my recyclables to that place. I pay a small fee. So this guarantees work for the waste pickers, and also they have access to the green, the vegetable garden in a way that it kind of improves the food intake. So just trying to connect, different things, waste and food, issues.
Well, in my presentation, I spoke about community gardens as being an important part of getting it right, and using the recycling logic of a circular economy really makes sense in agriculture. There should be a virtually zero waste process in agriculture. The manure from the cows or the horses or the goats is your fertilizer. You use your leftover food or the bits of plants for composting and creating healthy soil for growing more fruit and vegetables, even within cities. And I noticed in the chat in Spanish, a lot of people were talking about the different cities where they have built up community gardens. Another place where I've seen it is in Mexico City, where they have really good community gardens. In New York, they have huge numbers of small community gardens. I think we went and visited them together, Sonia, some of them. And yeah, I think what you can't do in urban agriculture is you can't grow grains. You can't grow rice, you can't grow wheat, you can't grow any of the grains that require a large space. You can have many small pockets of community gardens or allotments. And you can also recycle tires or bottles, glass bottles or plastic bottles for growing plants on your balcony or in a very, very small area in a vertical way, using traditional soil, but different kinds of containers. So, you can do a huge amount. Everywhere, there are brilliant ideas everywhere that I've seen around the world, You just have to find out what works for your city, what works for you. I saw there's a question from Indonesia for me as well. Where should you start? Well,
this could be the last question because we have 10 minutes just.
Okay.
But I think it's a good last question.
You should really start by doing what you can yourself, by talking to people, by growing some of your own food, by talking to your local elected representatives, by talking to local producers. Any point in the food chain is where you can start. There is no one answer to that very good, very logical question. It's got to be, as you said, quite rightly, community driven. So community driven can be a group of 2 or 3 or 4 families starting something, or more people.
Thank you very much, Judith and Sonia. I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Can I ask if we still have time for Frances, in case she wants to make her comments on the issue of formalization, because I gave my point of view from waste and being a technical person, and I think it might be interesting to hear her out.
Of course. Frances, if you are here, you can open your mic and tell us more about this. I saw she just connected like
Have
2
we
minutes
lost
ago.
her?
Maybe she has some connection issues because I saw she went out and in again, and maybe
Pity.
But you're right. It could be interesting to have her opinion. Well, anything else? Maybe you want to say? Thank you very much, Judith and Sonia. It was really interesting. And like I said at the beginning, today it's Earth Day. And I think the two themes we chose for today were perfect for this topic.
Francis back, it seems.
Yes.
She said that her network was down.
Okay. Yes. If Francis, if you want to say something, go ahead.
Okay, maybe
Yeah, she's here.
she's gone again. Just sorry.
I don't know. Yes. Okay.
Yes, she's gone.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're here. So
Thank you. The network was bad. I was out of line before. Concerning the formalization, we have been trying to formalize here. Are you hearing me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Concerning the formalization, we've had the training through StreetNet. We had the workshop through StreetNet, and we've started the process here in Nigeria, and we believe the formalization will help us in a long way. So, and we've been able to link up with Ministry of Humanitarian Services in Nigeria, where we requested for support for our members concerning the COVID survivor benefits. So we hope very soon they will answer our call. So formalization is a good thing. It will help the organization to move forward. Thank you.
thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So just to conclude, para concluir, muchas gracias a Judith y a Sonia y a Francis por esta presentación. Así terminamos la sesión 3. Compartimos en el chat y por WhatsApp también links a Twitter. Estamos haciendo un hilo de Twitter, así que si quieren compartir y retuitear con los resúmenes y lo que hemos dicho en esta clase, lo pueden hacer. Enviaremos las presentaciones y los contactos para poder seguir conversando sobre estos temas. Y la presentación y la grabación que estará disponible en YouTube a partir de mañana normalmente. La próxima clase, próxima semana, jueves, a la misma hora, sobre producción social del hábitat y los asentamientos informales. Nada más, queden atentos al Google Classroom, habrán otros desafíos y tareas, así que eso es todo por aquí. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.